Welcome to Relationscapes. We're mapping the stories and ideas that shape who we are and how we connect with each other so we can build a more just world. I'm journalist Blair Hodges, and our guide in this episode is author Jessica Slice.
At that point in my life, I was a runner, I was extremely active, a business owner, really just didn't think of my body as something that could fail or would fail. And then I woke up and couldn't get out of bed. I was extremely dizzy, and I ended up never feeling well again.
Before becoming disabled, Jessica was building a business and running miles and miles every day, chasing perfection, and parenthood didn't really fit into that life, especially because Jessica was sure she'd never measure up. But when her body collapsed at 28, everything shifted. Disability stripped away the life she knew and uncovered something unexpected. She wouldn't have to be perfect to be a mom. But unfortunately, she would have to fight to become one in a world designed to exclude her. Her new book is called Unfit Parent. A disabled mother challenges an inaccessible world, and she joins us right now to talk about why we've got to make the future of parenting more accessible and why everyone will benefit when we do. Jessica Slice, welcome to Relationscapes.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
At the beginning of these interviews, as a journalist, I always want to start off with something that's going to grab listeners' attention and say, like, this is really worth your time, because introductions really set the tone. And I loved your introduction because you talk about that exact thing. You're like, how am I going to start this book? You're kind of wrestling with the decision of how to begin this book. What was going through your mind? What kind of options did you have?
My first instinct, which wasn't my best instinct, was to start the book with a defense of all the times that I have been crucial in my eldest child's life, that I wanted to start the book with kind of this defensive posture of, I'm disabled, but let me prove to you why my child is lucky to have me. And when I thought about it more, I realized that I really don't like smelling defensiveness on other people. You know, I think you can really sense the emotion or the intention behind words. And I wanted to do my best to not go in like trying to prove myself. And so I took the approach of starting the book describing, I think, not an entirely flattering scene of me parenting, which is just playing very old video games on the couch with my kid. And I started
Super Mario. You can name drop. It's
sponsored by 1987 Super Mario 3. Yeah.
Sales are going to skyrocket. Yeah. I loved that scene, though. And I don't think it was, I think so. So I think some people might judge that kind of parenting like, oh, here's a mom just laying around playing video games with their kid. That doesn't seem like great parenting. But I think it's just, it can be a part of great parenting. It's sort of, to me, it seemed just sort of a mundane kind of thing, kind of fun thing you can do with your kids. So maybe that's because also I'm a guy. Maybe my sort of male privilege has put me in the position of more often being the fun parent who might want to do video games or something.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I think as a disabled parent, I feel a need or like a push from society to show that I'm as good or better than other parents and not something like just sitting on the sofa.
And you say that you also want to include some of the difficult stuff, the bad stuff, the unflattering stuff, but that can be scary, especially for a parent who's disabled. Talk about what kind of fears might come up.
Well, a big part of the book, and something I really don't talk about much until the end, because I want a reader to get to know the details of disabled parenting before getting to the part where I talk about the worst parts. But the big elephant in the room of disabled parenting is child protective services. It is a disproportionate number of disabled people who lose their custody of their kids to CPS. One attorney I spoke to for the book said that she has never met a parent who lost custody of their kid who wasn't disabled. And in many states, in 22 states, it's legal to remove a child simply because the parent is disabled. Every person I spoke to who had given birth had CPS called while they were in the hospital. I did not interview a disabled parent who had not interacted with Child Protective Services. And so, so there's this one lane of parenting conversation is to kind of joke about, oh my gosh, I'm such a bad mom. Listen to these things I did. But that's an avenue that's not available to parents who lose custody on a regular basis. You know, far more Black people lose custody of their kids than white people. And I would say like that it's probably the same there. Like a Black mom who, you know, relies on the social safety net would be far less safe to joke about ways that she is cutting corners as a parent than a wealthy white mom.
It sounds like it can be quite risky then to talk about difficulties of disabled parenting. And a lot, as we'll talk about later on, a lot of your early experiences of parenting had to do with proving your ability as a parent because you were already, from the outset, being judged as maybe this person isn't worthy to be a parent or able to be a parent in the name of protecting kids. And yeah, if any listeners are thinking, well, I mean, if more kids are getting taken away from disabled parents, maybe that means they're not doing a great job. But I think it's important to point out that if the system is looking and scrutinizing disabled parents differently than other parents, that is a good way to explain the disparity. Not that parents with disabilities are less worthy or less effective as
right.
parents.
I think, yeah, I don't know how much in the weeds you want me to get with this, but when someone works as a social worker or as a doctor or a nurse or a teacher, they're what's called a mandated reporter, which means if they see any sign of neglect or abuse, they're obligated to call that in to Child Protective Services. What's complicated is that if they don't, they can be held liable, but also they can be criminally prosecuted. So there is a huge pressure if you are in these certain positions, a pastor, to call in concerns about child abuse. And I think in many ways that is so important. But what's tricky is that disabled parents, because of wage gaps for disability people, because of reliance on medical care, because of Social Security disability insurance and Social Security insurance, we interact with mandated reporters far more than the average population. So there's this huge exposure bias for being called in. And it's the same for anyone who is relying on food stamps or WIC or Medicaid. Anyone who is in that position is being exposed to mandated reporters more and is therefore being called in more. And that also doesn't account for just the inherent bias that people have. You know, that if you see a child riding on a wheelchair, you may question the safety of that situation. And that's an inherent bias, not based on fact. And that's even separate from mandated reporters. And so the rate that kids are removed actually has almost nothing to do with parenting capacity and has to do with a flawed system and flawed people. And I may be spending too much time on this, but I also want to say that almost any of the positions that a mandated reporter has is an impossible job to get if you're disabled. And so, like, I'm a social worker and I encountered a lot of difficulty getting my degree. And so actually very few social workers are disabled. Very few doctors are disabled. You know, 25% of people are disabled and 2% of doctors. And so not only are mandated reporters more exposed to disabled people, they are much less likely to be disabled and to have the lived experience as a disabled person. And so the system is flawed from like 40 directions all at once. And then the result is disabled people lose our children.
And we'll get back to this a little bit later on to talk about things the system could do differently. But I also want to recommend to listeners another episode we did on Child Protective Services with Jessica Price, an earlier episode that really goes into the racism that's inherent in the system. And it intersects a lot with conversations of disability too. So people can check that episode out. All right. So as you're starting this book out, you're worried about sort of talking about the bad stuff or the difficult stuff because of what we just talked about. But also there's a risk on the other side, the good stuff, because sometimes stories about people with disabilities or stories by people with disabilities can become sort of inspiration porn, or like the super crip is a phrase that I learned in disability studies. The idea that stories about disabilities can inspire us and can lift us up. And it kind of turns disabled people into tools to make us have a smile on our face. We might see a cute story of a kid with Down syndrome getting to play on the basketball team. And isn't that great? And he gets to go in and shoot one basket and hip, hip, hooray. And so you're also juggling how to talk about lessons and things people can learn from disabled parents, but without making people with disabilities mere object lessons. So talk about doing that dance.
Well, I mean, it's obviously extremely tricky. One, I think when you are complimented for doing a very normal thing that presumes some level of deficiency or incompetence, like that's a real kind of red flag of inspiration porn, what people say. Or, like an example that I refer to is one time I was in Oakland sitting outside a coffee shop, drinking a macchiato and reading a book. And someone came up to me and said, "Good for you." And I mean, kind of good for me for like taking a moment to myself and reading on a nice day, but I don't think that's what they meant. I think they meant like,
you're a macchiato fan.
Yeah.
Maybe
good for you for knowing that espresso is delicious. But I think they were saying like, good for you for leaving the house, for being outside. Wow. It was really hard. And but I will also say, like, you can kind of smell it when people are seeing you as an object. Just like I said, you can smell, when someone's disingenuous in writing. Like, I know it when it's happening. Yeah. There's this, sense of pity. There's also like people who choose to pray for me in public or who offer advice or yell.
Do they use like a childlike voice with you ever, or like kind of look down at you if you're in your chair and be like, "Oh, hello, hi"?
One of my favorite is, I was actually waiting for my dog at the vet. I was in my wheelchair and I was reading, I think, the Times, like the actual paper. And a man came up and said, "Hello, would you like to pet my little cat?" Oh. And I was like, no, thanks.
Thank you, sir.
I'm just a grown-up. I'm just
so weird. I think
so bizarre.
I think people sort of are trying to cope with they feel uncomfortable, or they so they're going to overcompensate. It sort of reminds me of how some boomer parents will, when they're telling you a story, "Oh, I met the loveliest man on the train, and he was Mexican," and they have to add these details where you're like, I didn't need to know that. That's not pertinent to the story. But I think it comes out of discomfort or, yeah.
But I like the thing that is so tricky and the needle to thread in this book is that I actually do believe disabled people have a unique and particular wisdom to offer as parents that I don't, I both don't want to be praised for doing very normal things, but also we have some lessons to teach about parenting. And, you could argue that is being praised for doing a very normal thing, which is parenting. So there is a combination, but I think it's that when you look at someone with pity and then you feel like, well, good on you for still existing despite your tragic life, that does not feel good. When you say, "Oh, you have had a different experience of me, and I would love to learn what you have discovered from your particular viewpoint," that does not feel like pity. That feels like respect, and it feels like we're now equals, and we both have something to offer.
And I think, in addition, and this really stands out in your book, is some of the lessons that people who aren't as disabled can learn actually demand things of us, actually demand things of other people. Instead of just being inspired and getting like a nice feel-good buzz, you're calling attention to systemic issues. You're calling out prejudices. You're talking about things that have the tendency to make people uncomfortable if they're not familiar with disabled people, or if they don't have the same types of disabilities or haven't experienced disability. And so I think that's the other thing is, okay, it can be inspiring, but is it also challenging? So I think your book has lots of advice that can improve people's experience of parenting regardless of their abilities, and also is making demands on readers because the world could be better in general for people with disabilities, and that would make it better for everybody. So, but that's going to make people have to do stuff. Maybe you don't want to do stuff.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah. If you sense that your interaction with a disabled person is making you reevaluate or change, like that's probably a respectful interaction.
Yeah. All right. So I want to tell people before we move on, then the audience for your book, you're writing for disabled parents for solidarity and connection. They'll recognize themselves there, get some catharsis and maybe some inspiration. Disabled communities are excellent at giving each other tips and things like, here's how we do this. So that's number one. Number two, you're talking to non-disabled people or less disabled people so that they can reconsider what disability means in general and how society can change to accommodate disability better in ways that would benefit everyone. So you've got multiple audiences going on here. And one of the difficulties with talking to disabled parents is about 10% of parents have disabilities. Right. And a lot of them deal with being lower income based on work disparities or ability. So, so a market for this book might be tricky if you wanted to sell to disabled people only. I think publishers might be like, maybe there's not an audience for that. Did you encounter that at all as you were pitching the book?
So, it's funny. This book really I didn't pitch the book, I guess, is the answer to that question.
Okay.
Beacon approached me about the book. I've written about disabled parenting, and that's kind of my lane. And then they liked my writing, and we came up with the book together. And I think this particular publisher has such a commitment to printing and supporting books that will change the conversation and progress the conversation. That's really the ethos of the publisher. And so I didn't have to do a ton of market convincing. I will say that as I've written the book, it became clear to me that it is a book for all people. I think that the first blurber I contacted was Ed Young, and he's not disabled and not a parent. But I have for a long time admired his writing, and I also find he's sort of morally unimpeachable. I just really respect his commitment to his own values, and I sense that in his writing and in his work. And I once searched my text messages for Ed Young, and it was like horrifying how many times I had sent his articles to friends. It's like I just this long time,
Obsessed much?
Yeah, this is real professional admiration, but I just think this is the ideal writer. And so when I finished the manuscript and it was time to get blurbs, I told the publisher I wanted to see if he would blurb it. He, one, has no idea who I am, and two, is not the market for this book. But I sent him the book, and he warned me that while he would spend a little time with it, if it didn't feel like a fit, that I should not take it personally. But he's not a parent, not disabled. And he did read it. And when he was partway through, he sent me an email, and he said, just so you know, this book is changing my life. I cannot recommend it more highly, and I want everyone to read it. And then he finished
Well, thanks for the blurb.
Yeah. And then he, finished it and wrote me a very, very kind blurb. And I had written the book hoping that it would speak to all people, because it really speaks to our shared fragility, our shared mortality, the fact that we are all wrestling with bodies that break and lives that end. And I was so relieved that this person I've spent years respecting saw that in the book and spoke to that. And so I'm hoping that it does do that once it's out in the world.
I think it certainly does. This is a central theme to the book and to what disability can do. When people sit down and think about disability, here's a quote from you. You say, it forces a reckoning with our collective fragility and mortality. And I think people spend a lot of time running away from our fragility and away from our mortality. And this is actually something you can relate to in ways that some other disabled people can't, because you have an acquired disability. So we can think about people who were born with disabilities and it's just part of their life for as long as they can remember. But you became disabled in 2011. You were 28 years old by then. And even then, you didn't personally identify as disabled for 7 more years. So tell us about your experience of becoming disabled and embracing that as an identity.
My story of becoming disabled, I'll do a short version of that, is that I was on a hike on Santorini in Greece. I encountered a pack of wild dogs, which feels germane to the story, although nothing happened with the dogs. But because of them, I had to go off the path and add a lot of time to the hike. And I was already overheated when I saw the dogs. And I ended up developing heat exhaustion. And I got very, very sick, but assumed that I would be fine the next day. I was, at that point in my life, I was a runner. I had run 7 miles the day before. I was extremely active, a business owner, really just didn't think of my body as something that could fail or would fail. And then the day after the hike, I woke up and couldn't get out of bed. I was extremely dizzy, and I ended up never feeling well again. That hike triggered. And what I have since learned is it triggered a neurological condition, dysautonomia, which is actually quite common with long COVID. So it's now much more known than it was at that time. And that in my case, it was due to a connective tissue disorder, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is genetic. And I learned that when my sister, a year after I got sick, also developed the same symptoms. Well, no. So she got sick 3 years after me, because the first 2 years I was sick, I didn't have a diagnosis. And then I got diagnosed. And then a year after that, I found out it was genetic. And then it was still 4 more years of thinking I could find a way to not be sick.
Yeah, fix it.
And I am, I think it sort of oozes out of me. Like, I'm an extremely motivated, high-achieving person. And so when I learned that there were exercises I could do, there were medicines I could take, there are ways I could eat that would make me not sick anymore, I just fully committed. I did this extremely exhausting year-long cardiac rehab plan that caused intense discomfort every day, and I stuck with it. And it did almost nothing. I did everything anyone said, and I wasn't improving. And so I eventually had to come to terms with the fact that this is the body I live in. And at that time, because of grad school, I started to read some disability theory. And it was really the first time I had started to think that what I was experiencing, which is a body that is profoundly symptomatic, uses a wheelchair, has a disability placard, gets Social Security disability income, has a lot of reasons.
Already, yeah.
A lot of reasons to think I'm disabled, but it had truly not crossed my mind. And I started to read disability theory, and I was like, oh, I'm disabled. I'm not sick. Yeah. And for me, that realization, instead of this lonely experience of losing the life and body I loved, I switched to joining a community of people. And so I now became part of this group of people that have always existed and have built these systems and groups and ways of being and ways of thinking and loving. And it felt like coming alive to realize I was disabled and part of the disability community. It helped me feel like part of the world again. And through that, I also reevaluated the way I saw my own transition from healthy to sick. Instead of that was my life good and now my life is bad, I actually saw my existence with a new subjectivity, because I think we always have subjectivity. And I thought, well, the truth is
the way we think about ourselves, is that what you mean, subjectivity?
Yeah, and the way we think about anything is subjective. There is no...
In other words, it's personal. We're seeing it from where we are. We're not this objective mind floating in space that can see all truth or something.
No, we are terrible at, we can't see anything objectively at all, including ourselves, and of course. Yeah. And I just started to notice that I liked my life. That if I stopped assuming I didn't like it, I did like it. I like slow days. I like the way it's changed the way I think. I like the way it's changed my emotions. I like the way it's changed my relationships. I like being alive, and I like my life now more than I did 14 years ago before I became disabled. And I think it was realizing I was disabled that was sort of this gateway to feeling alive again.
I'd like to come back to that thought of liking your life better now. But first, you move into parenting more broadly, because as you point out, that parents, by and large, are pretty exhausted right now generally.
Yeah.
Exhaustion and parenting are going hand in hand. So you're like, hey, this shouldn't be a big leap for everybody to think about disability and parenting, because parenting's difficult and there's going to be some stuff people can relate to. What's interesting is you say that most of your friends who are parents and who are not disabled are barely hanging on. So what would it be like to be a parent and be disabled? And this really, I got to ask you about this. So instead of feeling like they had it easy, you didn't look at them and be like, oh, you guys are exhausted? Well, try not being able to stand up for longer than 30 seconds without feeling you're going to pass out.
Yeah.
You didn't do that move. You started feeling like an imposter. And I'm like, why? Why not say you guys got it easy instead of maybe I'm kind of an imposter parent?
I think it was because there were all these examples of parenting that that I have been constantly exposed to in media, in books and shows, and with my friends. And all of the examples didn't look like me and didn't perform like me, and there's this, the one that I thought of as the mom pacing around a room trying to soothe a child. I cannot pace. That would be impossible. The harried mom driving between practices and school, and I don't drive. There's just all these examples. The mom like cooking and running around the kitchen. I do not cook because we don't have an accessible kitchen, so I can't really use my own kitchen very well. And there were just all these ways of being a parent where I didn't see myself. And so it made me think, well, maybe I'm not really a parent.
What started changing your mind about it?
Well, writing about it. I wrote a piece in 2019 about feeling like an imposter. And I heard from hundreds of disabled parents saying like, me too. And I think hearing the details of other disabled people parenting, they felt like real parents to me. And so it made it seem like I could be too. And I think choosing to spend more time in the world of disabled parenting, just like choosing to spend time in the world of disability in general, gave me community and a sense of place and a sense of connection. And so I started to reevaluate the way I see my own parenting. And then as you might be getting to, I actually thought, and my parenting actually has some unique and valuable features of it that non-disabled parenting doesn't have.
Yes, we will move to that.
Yeah.
But I also want to point out this chapter, you base some of it on the work of Catherine Goldstein. This is a Harvard fellow and a journalist who you interviewed for the book, and she advocates for working mothers. And in her work, she's identified these factors that make parenting tough for everybody. And you present those to us and then show how people with disabilities are sort of the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to these factors. We can see them even more clearly in the lives of people with disabilities. So talk about those factors. What does she bring up as the stuff that's making parenting hard right now?
I think one that I really have noticed and that she mentioned is this pressure to have individuality as a parent, to not need help, to be able to manage everything on your own, which is impossible for everyone. Next, she talked about
or buy the supplies that'll help you do it.
Well, right. I mean, that's what she didn't mention, but I think about a lot is this like the consumerism.
Yeah, you add that.
Yeah, which is this like thought that if we just buy the right thing, or if we can buy enough things, that parenting will become possible and easy and beautiful. And that's just fundamentally not true. Also,
and I think you combining with her research brings that up because you probably have seen all this stuff, but as a disabled person, not a lot of this stuff is built for disabled people. So you might see these like offered solutions, but the consumerism often falls flat. One, because a lot of disabled people don't have the money for it, or two, because they're not built for disabled people. So you're like, cool that you came up with these contraptions and stuff, but like we can't use that.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's kind of what I get at in the book is that we have to reject the consumerism as answer because we can't use the beautiful products. And so we invent our own, and they're often pretty crappy looking. Like, they're these like our own in-home inventions, which is, I think they're gorgeous and interesting and, an example of creativity, but it's not this brand of parenting that that you're fed on social media, at least. So there's individuality, and then there's also workplace culture of it's difficult to get enough parental leave, particularly in the U.S., less so in Canada where we are, but it is difficult to make enough money for your family and have enough time with your kids. That is a difficult or really impossible thing to do. 3, the social safety nets are inadequate, particularly in the U.S., where I'm from. And 4 is gender inequity, which is something I was just writing about today because disability forces change gender dynamics in, cishet households. Like in our household, my husband does all the laundry and makes all the meals. And, I'm the money guy and I'm doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. But my own tendency to be hyper controlling would mean that if I weren't disabled, I would likely be doing 90% of everything. And so disability has, forced a changed gender dynamic. But in many households, there's a great deal of gender inequity with, they talk about emotional labor and invisible labor and then actual physical labor and the combination of all those things means that the woman in the household often carries more.
So with all those factors combining, people might feel like being a parent is just maybe not a great idea. And so for you, how was that? Did you always want to be a parent? Did you bring this from your before you were disabled to, I've just always wanted this? Like, how did you know and how did you decide to become a parent?
So I don't think I write about this a ton. I maybe touch on it, but I did not want to be a parent. And that was mostly because I thought I would be a terrible parent before I was disabled. I knew that the way that my perfectionism and my relentlessness worked inside my own brain meant that if I were tasked with caring for another person and raising them and helping them be emotionally healthy, that I would be completely ill-suited for that task. That it was such a kind of toxic, high-pressure disaster inside of me that it would ooze out all over any innocent baby I were to bring into my life.
Yeah, I like what you said. I think it was your therapist. I think you said it was your therapist who said, like, you're a perfectionist. And you're like, no, I'm not. I'm not good enough to be.
I've never done anything well enough to be a perfectionist.
Yeah.
She was like, yeah, that's the whole thing, yes.
So what shifted then? If you had those kind of fears, people might expect that becoming disabled would just amplify, like, okay, well, that kind of does it.
For me, and I don't want to say this is true for all disabled people, but for me, disability pried that perfectionism out of my hands. I cannot succeed and achieve and perform anywhere close to perfect now. I have to rest so much. The limits of my body are so firm that it forces me to do a lot of things halfway. My house is messier than I want it to be. I work much, much, much less than I would ever want to each day. Every part of my life is changed by my disability. And I discovered, I want to make sure to answer this like as truthfully as I possibly can.
You can lie too if you want.
No, I think this is the crux of it. And so I want to make sure I do it.
Good.
I learned that I like myself and that I am a good and interesting and worthwhile person without achievement and without perfection. And that a very slow life spent mostly in bed with an uninteresting diet and no travel is a good life, and that I am worthwhile. And I think that liking myself and I think that loving my life makes me a very, very good parent.
And when you arrive at that for yourself, you're still going to face more obstacles. You talk about how deciding to parent for whatever reason, you dealt with infertility, so you had to go through that and get into the foster care system and all the obstacles that there. So there's a lot of external prejudice and obstacles that happen, and also some lingering internal shame and doubts about it. Maybe give us an example of each of those, of the kind of external prejudice that a disabled parent might face and some internal shame or doubts that a disabled parent might feel.
So I was someone who did not have much attachment to physically carrying a child. And so when I was told that for me it would be dangerous, I let it go pretty easily. And that's not the experience for many people. And for whatever reason, that's something that I did not have a strong attachment to. A lot of disabled people I interviewed for the book are dissuaded from becoming pregnant. It's very difficult to get accessible care, pregnancy care. There's people who are dissuaded both because doctors don't know what to do with them, but also because they're worried about having the disabled person have a disabled child. There's that prejudice. For me, the obstacle was because we wanted to be foster parents, we had to get a doctor to say that I was physically capable of parenting. And that was an extremely scary thing to ask. He ended up saying yes without reservation, but I was I was very nervous to do it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful scene because he's like, a child would be lucky to have you as a parent. But all of the anguish and turmoil that like you had to go through to even get to that point. I mean, it's a lovely thing that the doctor said, but the circumstance itself is very difficult.
Right. And
I don't know what word to use for that. Difficult.
No,
like,
it is.
It's not good.
No, bad. And
Bad.
I interviewed this Harvard doctor, Paige Church, and she's a disabled parent. And she also had to get a doctor to say she could parent.
Yeah.
When she adopted.
She's a doctor.
Yeah. She's just this extremely high achiever, very competent.
Yeah.
And she also had to go to someone, and it's this like supplication of, will you say I'm good enough to parent?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then just the classes that you had to do, that sounded like a nightmare, like because of what your body needs. Like temperature's a real issue for you, where your body's postured is an issue, what you're sitting on. They are going to kind of take you into this like classroom that's not set up for any of this stuff and expect you to sit there for, was it like 6 hours at a time or something like this?
4 6-hour sessions.
And they're like, if you can't do it, then maybe you can't be a parent. Maybe you're not
Yes.
good enough. This kind of proves our point.
Yes.
You're like, but parenting isn't like this.
I have now been a parent for 8 years, and at no point has anyone made me sit upright in a hot room for 6 hours. Like that's never once come up.
Yeah. You've missed a few things. Like you talk about when your kiddo went to the hospital, it was hard for you to like stay home. So there's some things there. But again, this gets back to the fact that you're not parenting alone, that you have other resources that ultimately no parent does. What if a parent is sick? Like I got the shingles real bad once. And I was down and out for like a week. And I fortunately have a partner who could take care of our kids when I was down. Nobody's asking me, well, what's going to happen if you get sick? What's going to happen to your kids? Nobody's asking me that.
Right. Yes, this expectation that anything I couldn't do is an indication that I shouldn't do anything is flawed.
Yeah.
You can't do everything. I think you're not disabled, but I also know that you are not infinitely powerful, and you don't have every single skill your partner has. You don't have every single skill every other parent has. We all have certain strengths and weaknesses as humans. I don't think disability is wholly different. And I would also say, the hospital example is a tricky one because I don't know that I think ambulances should necessarily be accessible in case there's a disabled mom. Like, I don't know that it would make sense for ambulances to be big enough to allow for my power wheelchair to fit inside. But there's a lot of things I've missed that I think are pure accessibility issues. If my child went to a school and I couldn't enter her classroom for 2 years, and, in that case, I place the blame firmly on the school's accessibility and not on my body. I think...
How'd they get around ADA? Was it like it was a historic building or something like that? Okay.
But I think,
Ooh.
Also the historic building thing, don't get me started. There's a lot of places with just one step that could build a ramp pretty easily, and they're like, sorry, it's too... And people get very proud about being grandfathered out of ADA. I'm like, that's not a brag. It just means you're excluding us. It's not... And so I think there are also cases where I haven't been able to go to things where I refuse to say that's a deficiency of my body.
No, it's a great point. And another great point you raise here, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit, is even apparently able bodies can get caught out by problems in the medical system. You interviewed Jordan, one of these mothers who talked in the book, who saw herself as a really strong, independent person who could achieve whatever she put her mind to. But then infertility she experienced, which really took the wind out of her sort of sails of being this independent person. But then also child loss crushed that mentality. She learned through her experiences that she was vulnerable too, that disability is sort of always hovering in the background for anybody.
Right. I mean, that people really don't like to think about disability and really like to pretend that they're very far away from it, I think in general, because it's a reminder that everything is fragile. But I think carrying kids and giving birth is often a forced reckoning with fragility, and it's often a reminder that nothing is promised and that everything is fragile. And I included her story in the book. I think I said it explicitly why, because she is such a unique example in that she had almost zero hardships up until becoming pregnant. And so her experience of infertility and pregnancy loss and repeated pregnancy loss and just complete and utter heartache was so profoundly destabilizing to her and extremely lonely because society's encouragement to ignore our fragility meant that she thought she was invincible. And so when she got there, the ground disappeared from underneath her feet. And I think if we all had a better understanding that not knowing what will happen is the thing we share, that when the worst thing happens, when we suffer, that we won't feel the bottom drop out. At least we will suffer, but we will feel connected to other people. We will feel like here I am in our shared suffering that we all have, that we all experience, instead of what's wrong with me? Why have I gone off the path that I'm supposed to be on, which is a idealized life.
Yeah, I loved your chapter called The First Week because it touches on this exact point. A lot of parents, and especially mothers, talk about the first few weeks after labor and delivery and having the kid as a living nightmare. Sleep is an issue. Their bodies are feeling like they're alien to them, and pain and all the recovery. Whereas your experience, I mean, you were a foster parent, but with a young child, so kind of similar there, but you had a terrific beginning. It was sort of wonderful. And it wasn't just you. You've talked to other disabled parents and even some who have delivered their own children who also had a great beginning. And you saw this pattern emerge where you're like, okay, people with disabilities seem a little more likely to be able to weather that first really difficult period.
Yes, that was the most surprising part of writing the book, actually, because I did so many interviews for this book. And I thought what I would end up, I knew I wanted to write about the beginning because it's such an emotional time for everyone. But what I expected is that there would be this set of complications or set of concerns or set of difficulties for disabled people, and then a different set for non-disabled people, and that I would sort of compare and contrast approaches. But what I found is that in all but one case, disabled people said, oh yeah, it was fine. And every non-disabled person I talked to said, this was the worst week of my life. And I was like, what is happening here? And it took a long time to write that chapter because I had to really think through it. And I kept doing more and more interviews. And I actually still continue when I come across a disabled person who has had kids. I ask them about their first week. And so far it has stayed true. So I don't have IRB approval. This isn't an official study, but I've continued to ask these questions. And well, so what I'll go back to also is the disabled people in many cases had profound medical complications. One woman I spoke to, Jesselina, who's incredible, she does most of her parenting with only her mouth. And she doesn't have, really any strength in any of her limbs. And she had her childcare fell through right after she gave birth. She had a family member coming into town to help, and it didn't work out. So she had to do almost all of her baby care while recovering from giving birth with only her mouth. And she had invented this crib blanket pulley situation that I've seen photos of. It's ingenious. And she did it all. And I was like, oh my gosh, this sounds terrible. How was it? She's like, oh, it was fine. It was a wonderful time of bonding. We just were in bed together for a week, getting to know each other. And I was like, what is this about disability that makes this huge transition with a lot of physical agony and so much uncertainty not bad? Like, why is that? Why is that?
Yeah. What'd you find?
Well, I mean, nothing official, but my thesis, and which is backed up by, some research, is that disability forces us to practice adaptation and to practice a familiarity with discomfort and slowness and, like I keep saying, fragility, so that when, you think you know how it's going to go with a newborn, but then it never goes that way. And disabled people are accustomed to being like, okay, that didn't work. Let's try another thing. Let's try another thing. When there's an obstacle, we face so many ridiculous obstacles on a daily basis that newborn-related obstacles are just par for the course. That's one. Two, a lot of disabled people experience chronic pain and unreliable bodies and discouraging interactions with medical care. And so the actual recovery from giving birth for a disabled person, is not so far outside a standard daily experience. The
Just so sad. That's an indictment, right? You have a whole chapter on medical care. Like,
right.
I love your caveats. You're not like, see, and this makes disabled people the best. Like, be like us. You're like, okay, you can learn these things from us. Also, these systems could change to make it better for everybody.
Yes.
And just because you're disabled doesn't mean you're going to have all these qualities or have the opportunity to develop all these qualities. So your caveats are really important here. You're like,
yes.
I'm not saying everybody with disability becomes super parent or is super flexible and is amazing. I'm also not saying that those who do mean we don't have to change the system. You're pointing out all of those things. It's a nuanced argument that you're making.
Yes.
And I don't know if the algorithm's going to favor the nuanced argument. I don't think it will.
We'll see. No, I don't think so.
You're not going to see TikTok reels about this, like TikTok about nuance. Like, here we go.
Well, there's a number of things I talk about in the book that that are like, rooted in nuance that I have a lot of concern about. But but then there's also this, like, I talked to this OBGYN at UCLA who works with mostly disabled people. And I talked to her actually after the book was finished. But, and she was saying that her opinion is that people are sold such a bill of goods about having a kid. Like, they're told this is going to be this magical time of falling in love with a baby. And that she thinks disabled people somehow are insulated from being sold that lie. I think there's this, like, just our familiarity with medical care and with bodies and neediness and interdependence and all these things. And so that the adjustment feels a little different. But a lot of non-disabled people, particularly those who have had limited other physical struggles, the reality differs so dramatically from what they expect that it's that, when expectations fall short, that's, where a lot of suffering comes from. And so she blames it on that, which I think is true. I also, and this is like, it's a little more complicated, but I think you and your listeners can handle it. I think recovering from giving birth and caring for a newborn is where the line between disabled and not vanishes. I think a person who has given birth, their body is temporarily disabled. C-section recovery, vaginal birth recovery, those are hard, painful processes. And I think that is a version of disability. I also think, if you define disability as a body that needs, that a body that's dependent, that's a body that's unreliable, then a baby is like the ultimate disabled person. And I think that being a person who has given birth with a baby who is so needy is this relationship with interdependence, a relationship with unreliability, a relationship with community need, with stillness, with all of these features of disability that are terrifying. And I think it's because we reject all of those qualities in society, and then you suddenly are forced to live in them. Yeah. And without comfort with disability, without comfort with independence, with interdependence, without that kind of comfort, that time is horrible. And so I actually think including a comfort with disability in general would then insulate people in that first week, and it wouldn't be as terrifying.
Right. And this connects up. We mentioned CPS earlier, and I said we'd get back to some changes. I'll just mention right here, you'd like to see a shift away in people's mindsets from this fake ideal of individualistic parenting.
Yes.
Toward models of community parenting, toward systems that can help parents who need additional help.
Right.
Away from individualism, basically.
Yeah.
And I think behind that, I wonder how much a drive for privacy is behind some of that. Like, people don't want the state involved as much, or they don't want to involve other people because there's a drive for privacy. But I think that's a balance we need to do way better at striking of like, maybe privacy can become way too extreme and we're hurting ourselves in expecting individualism because we don't want anybody in our business or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's the trade-off that people might be resisting. Because I was just trying to think, like, why are we resisting this? Like, why don't we want help,
Well, I think I have an idea, and it's that we don't want to die. And that here's, I think the kind of transitive property of it is if we have needs, then we are weak If we are weak, we are mortal. If we are mortal, this life ends. And anything that gets anywhere close to our mortality, we just want to stay far, far away from. And I think disability is a reminder of mortality, but I also think giving birth is a reminder of mortality. I think babies are a reminder of mortality. And I think confronting that reality is devastating. And it also causes like very real and practical pain. There's this one mom I interviewed for the book who's non-disabled, and her baby had to go to the hospital regularly after birth. And it was about a half-mile away, and the mom walked the baby to the hospital every couple days. And when she was talking to me, she said that walk was agony. My back hurt so much. I was so weak. I was so dizzy. And I thought, how can I go on like this? Will my life ever improve? And all I kept thinking is, why did no one give this lady a wheelchair? Like, there are literal things for this, and it's like, get
There's
a wheelchair.
an invention for that.
You just don't walk. And I thought, we are so scared of disability and so scared of our bodies being fragile that we will suffer over and over and over again, instead of saying, like, I need help. I can't do this. Please, someone push me in a chair. And that felt like a real example of why that week is hard.
That's Jessica Slice. We're talking about her book, Unfit Parent, A Disabled Mother Challenges an Inaccessible World. Her works appeared in places like the New York Times' Modern Love column, in the Washington Post, Glamour, and Cosmopolitan. And she's also author of a couple other books. There's a book called Dateable, Swiping Right, Hooking Up, and Settling Down While Chronically Ill and Disabled, and a book called This Is How We Play, a celebration of disability and adaptation. You can follow her work online at jessicaslice.com. Jessica, let's talk now about ableism. You say that perhaps the biggest assumption that people make about people with disabilities, and it's one that you shared earlier in your life, is that being disabled just makes people fundamentally unhappy. This connects to what you were just saying about this, like, weakness, death, etc. And people think that being disabled is just a bad life. I mean, doctors warn against having children with disabilities. And anyone who's had a kid has probably had this kind of conversation with a doctor if some sort of genetic abnormality or genetic difference is detected. And you write in the book, you have an example of this. And I wanted you to read what someone might hear from a doctor about a disabled life, the kind of warning that parents might get. Do you mind reading that for us?
Okay. In the near future, researchers will likely identify the genetic markers of my condition, hypermobile EDS. I imagine amniocentesis revealing that abnormality, and a genetic counselor or doctor explaining what it means. Your child will be in pain every day of their life. They have a high likelihood of developing digestive and neurological complications. They should avoid most contact sports because of the risk of injury. They will need regular ocular and cardiovascular testing to monitor for additional complications. Many people with HEDS need to have wheelchairs at least some of the time. In some cases, pregnancy is dangerous for a person with HEDS. Many cannot work, or the type of job they can do is limited.
And you say that all of that's true, but you also say a description of your illness doesn't begin to describe the reality of your life. And I love the paragraph that you add to this. Here's something that the doctor couldn't have predicted about you. So read that paragraph for us.
She will live in Paris and Berkeley. She will marry a generous partner, and together they will adopt a baby who is joy personified. She will, in her late 30s, discover she's a writer and will find deep purpose and connection through that work. She will laugh easily and cry easily, and will hate cooked carrots, and will love clothes and have dozens of houseplants, and will think about coffee as she's falling asleep at night, and will read poetry every morning. She will hold on tightly to her friendships, and when she turns 40, dozens of those friends will send voice recordings of themselves reading her favorite poems. She will tend towards optimism and hope.
You said earlier that you would have believed in the past that you wouldn't have liked this life. In the book, you say, if you could go back in time and tell your 28-year-old self, maybe read that doctor's paragraph to them, they might be horrified, but that somehow you do prefer your life now. Tell us about that transition.
I think that for me, disability made me feel like I'm part of the world. I want to be so careful with how I talk about suffering because suffering is suffering. It's miserable.
And you mentioned that some people with disabilities don't prefer the change. Like,
Right.
you're not saying everyone should.
I just think we have the right to say we do. And people have the right to allow their imagination to consider more ways of having a good life than just saying all that matters is my health. And, that there are other ways to define a good life. For me, I feel like I'm part of this story now. Like I'm in the world. The thing that we all share is that we suffer. And that is true for every person. And when I was so manically desperate to achieve and to never experience anything bad and to do every trip as beautifully as possible and to eat every meal as at the very best restaurants and to have the most fun with my friends and to have everything good, I was refusing to see this whole thing that is true is that we all suffer and that I like the honesty of my life now. I like the slowness of my life now. I like that it's forced me to tell the truth about myself and to myself. I like disabled people. I like their creativity and their joy and their strength and their determination to change things despite, many forces pushing back against us. Yeah, I just like it, which is surprising to me, but it is true.
There's a quote here that I'm going to put on a little note card and keep it where I can see it. You say, "What a gift to learn that we're terrible at predicting what will give us meaning and joy."
Yeah.
Yeah. And you found research backs this up, that when people ask people with disabilities, when it's been studied to say, what is quality of life? What do people expect the quality of life to be for people with disabilities? And what do people with disabilities actually say about their lives? Those numbers are very different.
Yes. And the vast majority of people who become disabled, their life reaches the same level of satisfaction that it did before, that there are many things that make a life hard and there are many things that make a life easy. But actually our ability to enjoy our life is far more complicated than we think. And we are truly very, very bad at knowing what will make us happy. I think we're terrible at it.
And maybe we're good at finding happiness when we just need to sometimes.
Yeah, I recently listened to an interview with someone who said that he thinks people seek medical or scientific solutions for existential problems. And it really struck me as true. I think wrestling with the reality of our lives is difficult and painful, and we seek a way out from that. But I think the only way is through.
I think about that too. Like if they could find a cure for some of these diseases, like I want research to do it. Like I know that can sneak over into ableism, especially when people talk about abortion and elective abortion for people with disabilities. But it's also to me part of the mission of alleviating suffering in the world. And I think you could still enjoy so many of the things you enjoy and not have your condition, but having your body has connected you with people that you wouldn't have otherwise been connected with and has given you things to think about that you might never have thought about, or at least maybe not till you're elderly and your body's changing then. Like if we're lucky enough to live that way, most people will become disabled in certain ways in our lives. And your book is a great reminder of that. And as we mentioned, it goes through thinking about medical care in the context of disability, thinking about child protective services, thinking about how to make a home comfortable, being a parent and seeing your kid, like pretty soon they're not just sitting on the little rug and playing with their toys, they're crawling. Oh no, what's a disabled parent going to do then? Then it's not fun enough for them to just go down to the end of the street with you in your chair, and the world's getting bigger. And what do parents do? You talk about all of these things in ways that really connected with my experiences of parenting, and I can't recommend this book enough.
Thank you.
Because, it gives me a new perspective, but also so much of it's familiar as well.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And with that on the table, let's talk about regrets, challenges, and surprises. It's the last thing I always bring up. Is there anything, your book's brand new, right? Like we're doing this as the book is just coming out. Is there anything that you looking back would change about it. Maybe there's nothing. That's fine. Some people say, nope, nothing I would change. Or what was most challenging about writing it, and then maybe surprises, anything you learned in the process of making this book. What comes to mind now as we're closing up here?
The regret is that the book has to cover such a breadth of topics because it's really the first book about disabled parenting, which is shocking. I mean, 10% of parents is a lot of people.
Yeah.
And any one part of the book could have been much longer and included more life experiences.
Each chapter could be a book.
Yeah, each chapter could be a series of, I mean, it's wild. And
Sure.
So inevitably, I have left people out of the book. There are stories and experiences that can't or haven't been included. And I think my regret is that someone will look for themselves in it and not find themselves. And I wish it could be as inclusive and diverse as possible. And I have done my best.
It's a great introduction. I mean, I hope it just inspires more and more work. We need a lot more work in this area. So congratulations on being a pioneer there.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jessica. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for talking with us about the book.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me here at Relationscapes. If this is your first time here, I'm happy to welcome you. I hope you'll stick around and check out some of our other episodes. If this isn't your first time, welcome back. I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. If it's good enough for you to come back and listen again, it's got to be good enough for you to review, right? We stalled out. We stalled out at 65 ratings. Let's go. We can do way better than that. If you love something, say something. That's my creed. You can do it right in the app, Apple Podcasts. Just find the show, go down to ratings and reviews. It's right there. You can also rate the show in Spotify now as well. Our theme song appears courtesy of Mates of State. Relationscapes is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm journalist Blair Hodges in Salt Lake City, and I'll see you again soon.